The textbooks call him a god of war. They show him in oil paintings, mounted on a white stallion, pointing toward glory. But if you could smell those paintings, they would reek of rotting horse flesh and gangrene. If you could hear them, they would scream with the sound of 100,000 lungs freezing solid in a single night. 1812 wasn't a campaign. It was a factory of death. And the man at the controls didn't care if the gears were made of iron or the bones of your sons. Today, we don't look at the maps. We look at the graves. History is often written by men sitting in warm rooms, far away from the scent of blood. They talk about logistics and strategic depth. But in the winter of 1812, logistics had a different name. It was called starvation. The Grande Armée was the most terrifying machine ever built by human hands. 600,000 men, 250,000 horses. It was a moving city of steel and muscle that stretched across the horizon. When they crossed the Niemen River into Russia, the sun was high, and the brass on their uniforms sparkled like gold. They thought they were marching toward a paycheck and a medal. They didn't realize they were the fuel. Napoleon Bonaparte did not see men. He saw arithmetic. He understood a cold, mathematical truth that would define the next century of slaughter. A bullet doesn't care if the finger that pulls the trigger is a seasoned veteran or a 17-year-old boy stolen from a farm in the middle of the night. Death is a volume business. And Napoleon was the world's greatest wholesaler. He had perfected a system of mass conscription that turned the French countryside into a conveyor belt of flesh. If he lost 10,000 men in a morning, he simply ordered 10,000 more to be harvested from the villages by sunset. It was elegant in its brutality. But even the most efficient machine needs to eat. As the army pushed deeper into the Russian interior, the landscape began to change. It didn't fight back with cannons. It fought back with silence. The Russians were practicing a strategy of scorched earth. Every mile the French advanced, they found nothing but ash. The grain stores were burnt. The wells were poisoned with the carcasses of slaughtered cattle. The houses were shells of blackened wood. Napoleon's army was designed to live off the land. They carried only enough food for a few weeks, assuming they would strip the Russian peasants of their winter supplies. But there was no land left to live off of. The machine began to grind its own gears. The horses, the literal engines of the 19th century, were the first to fail. Without oats, they began to eat the wet thatch from the roofs of abandoned huts. Their stomachs twisted. They died screaming in the mud. And then, the hunger turned on the men. When the belly is empty for long enough, the mind breaks. The soldier who once stood tall in a crisp blue uniform begins to look at his comrade not as a brother, but as a collection of calories. The Grande Armée was rotting from the inside before the first snowflake ever touched the ground. They were walking into a trap set by a man who refused to believe he could lose. The quiz. The Grande Armée's primary fuel was A. Stolen grain. B. Human arithmetic. C. Tactical genius. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. By August, the heat in the Russian interior was a physical weight. It wasn't the cold that began the killing. It was a sun that felt like an industrial furnace. The dust on the roads was so thick it turned the soldiers' lungs into sandpaper. Every breath was a struggle against a white, choking cloud that blotted out the horizon. But Napoleon, sitting in his carriage, didn't feel the dust. He felt the ticking of a clock that only he could hear. His advisors begged him to stop. They pointed at the maps, showing the lines of communication stretching until they were thin as silk. They pointed at the hospitals overflowing with men dying of dysentery and typhus. They suggested establishing a base at Smolensk, regrouping, and waiting for the spring. To a rational man, this was the only path. To a narcissist, a pause is a confession of weakness. Napoleon viewed the Russian landscape as a stage, and he was the lead actor. He needed a climax. He needed a city to burn. When the army reached Smolensk, they found exactly that. The city was a medieval fortress of stone and wood. Napoleon's heavy guns hammered the walls until the masonry shattered like glass. Inside, the wooden houses caught fire, turning the city into a giant chimney. The French stormed the gates, bayonets fixed, expecting to trap the Russian army in a decisive cage. They found a graveyard. The Russian commander, Barclay de Tolly, had slipped away through the smoke, leaving behind a charred skeleton of a city. No food, no beds, just the smell of roasted human flesh. Napoleon had spent thousands of lives to capture a heap of ash. But the victory looked good in the bulletins sent back to Paris. That was the only metric that mattered. In the emperor's mind, the Tsar would surely surrender now. He didn't understand that the Russians weren't playing a game of chess, they were playing a game of extinction. Back in the ranks, the Grande Armée was becoming a joke. The horses were dying in such numbers that the cavalrymen were forced to walk in heavy leather boots not designed for the march. The supply wagons were miles behind, stuck in the mud or abandoned by the roadside. The men began to realize that the genius leading them didn't have a plan for their survival. He only had a plan for his own reputation. As they marched further east toward Moscow, the air began to change. The nights grew sharper. The leaves began to turn. The summer was ending, and the trap was about to close. The soldiers looked at the horizon, hoping for a battle, because a bullet was starting to look more merciful than the hunger. The quiz. What was the prize at Smolensk? A. Fresh grain. B. Golden trophies. The answer is C. Charred ash. By September, the Russian command could no longer ignore the political demand for blood. The retreating strategy was working, but the heart of the nation was screaming for a fight. They chose their ground at Berezina, 70 miles west of Moscow. For Napoleon, this was the moment he had prayed for. A decisive engagement. A chance to prove his genius with a single, massive stroke. But Berezina was not a masterpiece of tactics. It was a head-on collision of two massive walls of meat. Napoleon lined his cannons wheel to wheel, creating a line of fire that literally shook the foundations of the earth. When the order was given, the bombardment was so intense that the shockwaves alone caused blood to burst from the ears of the men standing nearby. It wasn't a battle, it was a rhythmic pulverizing of human bodies. The French infantry were ordered to walk upright toward the Russian earthworks. They didn't run. They didn't take cover. They marched in tight formations, shoulder to shoulder, directly into the mouths of the Russian guns. The Russians responded with canister shot, tin cans packed with iron balls that turned their cannons into giant shotguns. When a canister round hits a human formation, it doesn't just kill. It disintegrates. It shears limbs from torsos. It decapitates a dozen men in the blink of an eye. The lead balls drive fragments of dirty wool and bone deep into the survivor's flesh, ensuring that if the impact didn't kill them, the infection would. The ground at Berezina became a paste of red mud and shattered bone. By midday, the soldiers were literally standing on piles of their own dead, just to get a higher vantage point to stab downward at the enemy. The fighting collapsed into a primitive, animalistic struggle. Men who had run out of ammunition used their muskets as clubs, caving in skulls, or used their bare hands to tear at eyes and throats. Behind the lines, the medical reality was even more horrific. Surgeon Larrey worked in a tent where the floor was a literal lake of blood. Without anesthesia, he performed over 200 amputations in 24 hours. He moved with the speed of a butcher, sawing through thigh bones in 12 seconds and tossing the limbs onto a pile outside that eventually grew taller than the tent itself. When the sun went down, 70,000 men lay broken on the field. Napoleon held the ground, but he had lost the soul of his army. He called it a victory. To the men in the mud, it was the end of the world. They looked at the road to Moscow and saw not a prize, but a long, narrow hallway leading into a trap. The quiz. Berezina's primary weapon was A. Clever flanking, B. Massed cannons, C. Cavalry charges. On September 14th, the survivors of the Grande Armée crested the final ridge and saw the golden domes of Moscow shimmering in the distance. To these men, starving, lice-ridden, and haunted by the ghosts of Berezina, the city looked like salvation. They imagined warm bread, soft beds, and a roof that would finally shield them from the sharpening wind. Napoleon entered the city with his head high. This was his trophy. He expected the keys to the city and a letter of surrender from the Tsar. Instead, he found a tomb. The streets were eerily silent. Doors hung open on empty houses. The rich and the poor had fled, leaving behind a city of 500,000 people that now held only the sound of French boots echoing on the pavement. But the Russians hadn't just left. They had prepared a final, vengeful gift. As night fell, the first fires began to flicker in the market districts. The governor of Moscow, Count Rostopchin, had released thousands of criminals from the prisons, handed them torches, and ordered them to burn it all. He had even removed the city's fire engines. The French tried to fight the flames, but it was like trying to fight the ocean. The firestorm grew into a self-sustaining monster. The heat became so intense it created its own weather system, a roaring vortex of wind that sucked oxygen from the air and pulled roofing off buildings. Men who had broken into wine cellars to celebrate found themselves trapped as the structures above them collapsed in a white-hot fury. They burned alive in the basements, surrounded by luxury they would never enjoy. Napoleon watched the capital of the Russian Empire disintegrate into a rolling sea of flame from the ramparts of the Kremlin. The sky turned a bruised orange, and ash fell from the sky like gray snow. His prize was turning into charcoal. Every rational voice in his staff screamed for a retreat. The window was closing. The Russian winter wasn't coming. It was already breathing down their necks. But Napoleon's narcissism was a trap of its own. He sat in the ruins for 5 weeks, writing letters to Tsar Alexander that went unanswered. He convinced himself that the Tsar was just 1 day away from surrendering. He waited. He waited while his men ate the remaining horses. He waited while they boiled their leather boots to make soup. And then, on October 13th, the first flake of snow drifted silently into the ash. It was a small, white speck, but it was the signature on his army's death warrant. The quiz. Moscow's gift to Napoleon. A. Golden keys. B. Scorched ruins. C. Silk tapestries. The retreat from Moscow was not a march. It was a slow-motion collapse. When the order to move was finally given on October 19th, the army didn't leave as a lean, fighting force. They left like a circus of the damned. Thousands of wagons, loaded with looted silver, silk, and paintings, groaned under the weight of Napoleon's vanity. He refused to leave the treasure behind, even as his men were beginning to starve. Napoleon attempted to take a southern route through untouched lands, but the Russians blocked the way at Maloyaroslavets. After a brutal fight, Napoleon did something his ego rarely allowed. He hesitated. Fearing another massive battle, he ordered the army to turn back and march along the old Smolensk road. This was a fatal mistake. The old road was a ghost path. The Grande Armée had already stripped it bare during the summer. Every farm was a blackened shell. Every well was filled with rot. There was no food, no shelter, and no hope. And then, the true Russian winter struck like a hammer. In the first week of November, the temperature plummeted to 30 degrees below zero. The air became a razor. Moisture in the nostrils froze instantly. The human body begins to shut down in a predictable, horrific sequence at these temperatures. To save the core, the brain redirects blood from the fingers and toes. The flesh in the extremities freezes. Ice crystals form inside the cells, puncturing the walls from within. The skin turns white, then a bruised purple, then a necrotic black. Men walked for miles on feet they could no longer feel, unaware that the bone inside was shattering. The moment a soldier sat down to rest, he was dead. His brain would slow, a false wave of warmth would flood his body, and he would unbutton his coat, lie back in the snow, and stop breathing. The horses died in thousands. Without winter shoes, they slipped on the ice, their legs splaying out and snapping with the sound of a pistol shot. The soldiers no longer waited for the animals to die. The second a horse fell, men swarmed it with knives, slicing raw meat from its flanks while it was still alive and screaming. They ate it bloody and cold because their fingers were too frozen to strike a flint for a fire. Discipline evaporated. Men stole boots from the dying. If a man found a small fire, the others would shove him into the flames to take his place. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were organisms operating on a single, primal instruction: survive. And through this landscape of skeletons, Napoleon rode in a warm, fur-lined carriage, sipping heated wine, shielded from the sight of his own failure by a wall of bayonets. The quiz. The winter's first victims. A. The officers. B. The horses. C. Answer is B. The cannons. The final act of the catastrophe unfolded at the banks of the Berezina River. By late November, the once mighty Grande Army was a shadow. Of the 600,000 who started, only a fragment remained, pursued by 3 Russian armies closing in like a fist. The river was a churning nightmare of ice slabs and freezing black water. It was not frozen enough to walk on, but too choked with ice to swim. The survival of the army fell to 400 Dutch engineers. They waded naked into the waist-deep ice water to build 2 fragile wooden bridges. It was a suicide mission. As they hammered pylons into the riverbed, the cold stopped their hearts within minutes. They died in the water so their brothers could walk over their submerged bodies. Out of 400, fewer than 40 would ever see their homes again. As the organized units crossed, a desperate mass of 50,000 stragglers, wounded men, women, and children, huddled on the eastern bank. Then the Russian artillery arrived. They opened fire on the crowded bank with canister shot. Panic turned the crossing into a slaughterhouse. People trampled each other to reach the bridge. On the morning of November 29th, Napoleon made a calculation. To save himself and the remaining soldiers who could still fight, he ordered the bridge to be burned. He didn't wait for the 10,000 civilians still trapped on the other side. They watched in horror as their only path to life went up in flames. Thousands threw themselves into the icy current, choosing a quick drowning over the lances of the approaching Cossacks. Napoleon did not look back. He abandoned the remnants of his army in a covered sleigh, racing for Paris to protect his throne and control the narrative. He published a bulletin admitting the losses but blamed the weather entirely. He ended the report with a line that defined his ego: "The health of the emperor has never been better." The Russian campaign was not a war, it was an extinction. Fewer than 10,000 combat-ready men emerged from the white void. The rest were left as monuments of bone. Napoleon would raise more armies. He would march more teenagers into the grinder at Waterloo, but the legend was already dead. Beneath the gold leaf and the marble statues lies a truth that history tries to hide. 6 million lives consumed to feed the hunger of one man who never learned how to say enough. The quiz. Napoleon's reason for burning the bridge. A. To stop Russians. B. Tactical necessity. C. Personal safety. If you enjoy dark untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.